In this video, we're going to look at how to tell the time using analog clocks. Those are these up here. We're also going to look at how to tell the time using digital clocks like these. And we're going to be able to tell the time and write them down using the 12-hour clock or the 24-hour clock system. And we're going to be able to write them in the form that we would more commonly speak. For example, 3:15 or 10 to 9. Here's the first example. We've got an analog clock here, and you'll notice that it's got the numbers from 1 to 12 around the outside, and the clock has two hands. The longer hand is the minute hand, and the shorter hand is the hour hand. Now, you should know there are 24 hours in a day, but you'll notice that there are only 12 hours on this clock face. And that means that the hour hand has to go around the whole clock face twice in one day, because 2 lots of 12 is 24. Now, there are 60 minutes in 1 hour. And what happens here is that the minute hand goes around the whole clock face once every hour, which means these numbers on the clock don't match up to how many minutes have gone past since the change of hour. These numbers correspond directly to the hours, and remember, because there are 60 minutes on this clock face, and this clock face is divided into 12 sections by these numbers, each of these sections is actually worth 5 minutes, because 60 divided by 12 is 5. So for the minutes hand, each of these sections is worth 5 minutes. So to recap, every hour the minute hand completes one full turn of the clock, and the hour hand goes from one number to the next, so from 12 to 1 or 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 and so on. Now, when the minute hand is pointing straight up at the 12, we have a time that is called something o'clock. It is 0 minutes past the hour. So this is effectively the 0 point for the minutes hand, and this number here, the 1, corresponds to 5 minutes past the hour. If the minute hand was pointing at 2, that would correspond to 10 minutes past the hour, and so on. In this particular case, we've got the hour hand pointing at the 2, which means in the 12-hour clock we would write the time as 2 for the hours, o'clock, and we would write that as 00 because there are 0 minutes past since 2 o'clock. That's told by the fact that the minute hand is pointing straight up at the 12, which remember is the 0 point for the minutes. Now we're not done yet. Remember we said that the hour hand has to go around the whole clock face twice in one day. So 2 o'clock actually happens twice in a day. How do we know which 2 o'clock we're talking about? Are we talking about the first one or the second one? Well, we can tell that by looking at this. This says AM, and that is the first one. It stands for anti-meridian, which is basically anything in the first 12 hours of the day. And PM, post-meridian, is what we would use for anything in the second 12 hours of the day. When we're talking about AM, we're basically talking about really early in the morning all the way up to noon. And PM corresponds to the afternoon, the evening, and the night, up to midnight. So this is how we would write the time in the 12-hour clock. We've got the hours, that's the 2, 0 minutes past, and we've got the AM. When you're writing a time in the 12-hour clock, you have to have either AM or PM. For part B, we need to write this time using the 24-hour clock. Let's look at what we've learnt. In the 12-hour clock, we have 24 times during the day when the minute hand is pointing straight up. That is once every hour. Remember, it goes around every 60 minutes or 1 hour, and at that point the hour hand is going to be pointing directly at one of these 12 hours, and each of those are known as an o'clock. So midnight is known as 12 AM. That is the first time we see 12 o'clock during the day. Then an hour later, the minute hand will have done one full turn of the clock and be pointing straight up again, and the hour hand at 1 AM would be pointing at 1. An hour later, we would have this time, 2 a.m. That's what we've got here. And then another hour later, we'd have 3 a.m. and so on, all the way until you get to 11 a.m. So at 11 a.m. you'd have the minute hand pointing straight up and the hour hand pointing at the 11. 1 hour later, we'd get back to 12 o'clock again, but because it's the second time we get to 12 o'clock, we call that 12 p.m. and that is noon. So from this moment on, we are in the afternoon and then into the evening and night. And you'll notice that we have to say AM or PM because all of these times happen twice during the day. And if we don't mention whether we're talking about AM or PM, it will be difficult to know which one we're talking about. If we mention 8 o'clock, are we talking about 8 in the morning or 8 in the evening? One alternative is the 24-hour clock. And what I've done is written all these times in the 24-hour clock. What you'll notice about the 24-hour clock is that we don't have to mention AM or PM at all. And all of these times are actually made up of 4 digits. We've got 2 digits for the hours. So even for numbers like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., we're actually writing that as 0100 or 0200, 0300, and so on. Of course, once you get to 10 o'clock in the morning, you don't need to put extra zeros in front of the hours because you are dealing with 2-digit numbers. Now, for the first half of the day, from midnight until noon, the times look pretty similar. You might have to add a 0 in the beginning to make sure you've got 4 digits and you get rid of the AM, but for the most part these look the same. The big difference is at midnight itself. Instead of saying 12 a.m, we call that 0000. And when we get to 12 noon, we call that 1200 hours or 1200. But when you then get to 1 p.m, instead of repeating the one that we've already used, we actually just carry on counting. We count that as 13, and then 2 p.m. becomes 14, 3 p.m. becomes 15, and so on. So for this question, for part B, writing this in the 24-hour clock simply gives us 0200 hours, and we would just write it like that. That's 2 a.m, which we saw in part A, and it's written like this. So remember, we've got the 4 digits, and there's no need to mention AM or PM. Finally, on question 1, for part C, to write it in this form, well, it would be a bit weird to call this 0 minutes past 2, but that's what this is. We are 0 minutes past 2 o'clock. So the most common or sensible way to write this would simply be 2 o'clock. Here's the clock for question 2. Now, the hour hand is pointing somewhere between the 7 and the 8. So the last o'clock that we'd passed was 7 o'clock. So we know that in the 12-hour clock, we would write that as 7 something. Now, how many minutes have passed? Well, the minutes hand is pointing at the 6 down here, and that corresponds to 30 minutes. You can see that because we've gone halfway around the clock, and remember the minutes hand goes around the clock once every 60 minutes. So if it's gone halfway around the clock, it's only gone around 30 minutes. Another way to see that, however, was to remember that each of these sections is worth 5 minutes. From 12 to 1, that would be 5 minutes for the minutes hand. From 1 to 2, that would be another 5 minutes for the minutes hand, and so on. And we've got 6 of these, which means 6 lots of 5, which is 30 minutes. So this is 7:30, but because we're writing in the 12-hour clock for this question, we can't stop there. We have to say whether it's AM or PM. We look at the clock and it says PM, so the answer is 7:30 PM. For part B now, we need to write this time using the 24-hour clock. Now, this is PM, so it's afternoon. So after 12 o'clock, we carry on counting, 13, 14, 15, and so on. 7:30 PM is 7 hours and 30 minutes after 12 noon. So after 12 noon, if we're going to carry on counting hours 7 more times, we go from 12 up to 19. That's simply 12 plus 7, and then we're 30 minutes past that. So 19:30 is the time using the 24-hour clock. For part C, we have to write that in the form something past something or something to something. Now, the most common way you would say this is 7:30, because we are 30 minutes past 7 o'clock. Here's question 3. Pause the video and have a go at this one for yourself. Here's the answer. For part A, using the 12-hour clock, we see the hour hand has passed 3 but hasn't yet got to 4. So the most recent o'clock was 3 o'clock, but then we've gone some minutes past that. The minutes hand has gone all the way round to the 9. That's 9 lots of 5 minutes. Remember, each of these sections on the clock represented 5 minutes, and 9 of those is 9 times 5, which is 45 minutes. So this time is 3:45, and remember the AM or the PM. In this case, it's PM. So the answer is 3:45 PM in the 12-hour clock. We can turn that into the 24-hour clock. We are dealing with a PM time, so that is the afternoon. So after 12, we carry on counting up the hours. So 3 hours after 12 would be 15. 12 plus 3 is 15. So that gives us 15:45. And remember, for the 24-hour clock, you don't put AM or PM. For part C, we would call this a 3:45. Rather than saying it's 3/4 past 3 o'clock, we are nearer 4 o'clock now. So we say we've got a quarter of an hour, that's this quarter of the clock, left to get to the next o'clock, which after 3:45 would be 4 o'clock. So that's a quarter to 4. Technically, it would be correct to say 15 minutes to 4, but again, it's not very common to say that when you're dealing with one of these fractions, a quarter past, a half past, or a quarter to, which is what we've got in this case, because the minute hand is pointing here. In this question, we have got a digital clock. Now notice we've got a 4-digit number, and we don't have an AM or a PM. So this clock has already given us the time in the 24-hour format. So the answer to B is simply 06:50. So B we can do straight away. For question A, we need to write this in the 12-hour clock. Now, because this number here is less than 12, we know we're dealing with an AM time. The first 12 hours of the day, remember, are AM. The second 12 hours, so from 12 noon onwards, we end up in PM, and PM times have a number for the hours that is at least 12, so 12 or more. This number is less than 12, it's only a 6, so we are dealing with an AM time, and that would just be 6:50 AM. For part C, writing it in one of these formats, we are dealing with 50 minutes past 6 o'clock, but because it's closer to 7, we would generally write that as 10 minutes to 7, or 10 to 7. Remember, there are 60 minutes in an hour, so if 50 minutes have already passed since 6 o'clock, there's only 10 more minutes to the next o'clock, which would be 7 o'clock. So 10 minutes to 7 is how we would say this. Here's the last question. Pause the video and have a go at this one for yourself. For part A, we know we are dealing with a PM time. That's because we've got a number that is at least 12 here. This number is actually more than 12. And how much more than 12 is it? Well, 19 take away 12 is 7. That means we are 7 hours after 12 o'clock. And that means we've got 7 something PM. How many minutes past is it? Well, it's 07. So 7:07 PM is how we would write this time using the 12-hour clock. Part B is easy. This is already written in the 24-hour clock. We know that because we've got a number here that is over 12. On the 12-hour clock, that never happens. So 1907 is how we would write that in the 24-hour clock. Finally, how would we write that in this form? Well, it's pretty close to 7 o'clock. It's not that much after it. So we're going to write that as 7 minutes past 7. Again, technically, you could write this as 53 minutes to 8, because in 53 minutes time, you would get to 8 o'clock. But that's pretty unconventional. We are closer to 7 o'clock, so we talk about being past 7 rather than to 8. So 7 minutes past 7.